From a network perspective, the end metric is latency, as any gamer can tell you. So let's dive into the world of delay and see what factors there are. Before we dive headfirst into this, I'm going deeper here than I have in the past. If you aren't a pedantic boffin like myself, then just ignore the numbers totally. By understanding that a microsecond is 1,000th of a millisecond, you'll be able to get the full context of what we're talking about here. The absolute values only matter to people like me. Now, time for me to admit that in a prior video, I oversimplified the concept of the speed of light and its impact as a gating factor. I wasn't sure how technical we should get, so I generalized. A portion of the community mentioned it in the comments, so let me correct the issue now. We need to start with a foundation, an agreed understanding of what's possible. Without that, we can't possibly know where we stand or how far we have to go. First, I'd like to define the timing terms I'll be using. 1 millisecond is 1,000th of a second, and 1 microsecond is 1,000th of a millisecond. For this conversation, let's round C to equal 300 million meters per second. This gives us a theoretical base of 3.33 microseconds per kilometer. This is where my overgeneralization in the prior video got me into trouble. You see, the speed of light in fiber is not actually equal to the speed of light. In that video, we touched on the idea of dispersion, which is what happens when the light reflects off the walls of the fiber and degrades ever so slightly. If you look at the graphic I used for that, you can catch my glossing over the fact that light transits a fiber by bouncing between the walls. Otherwise, the fiber would have to be arrow straight. With that in mind, and given our 300 million meters per second figure for C, let's look at some common data paths. And yes, I'm an old fogey, so I included the coax items purely for the enjoyment of it, but we aren't going to spend any time on them at all, other than the time we did just spend on them. Unshielded twisted pair operates at roughly 60% the speed of light. Microstrip and strip line are both methods used to connect chips on circuit boards, the little copper or silver lines you see on a circuit board. They operate between 50 and 60% the speed of light. Optical fiber operates at perhaps 2/3 the speed of light on average, which means if we were to run a fiber 10 kilometers in a straight line, it would take the light approximately 50 microseconds to transit it. If we used an RF signal, such as satellites use, it would take about 33 microseconds. Another comment I made was about conversions. We can see here that without any processing time accounted for at all, the PCB traces to move that signal through a circuit board are slower than the light in the fiber. Transit latency is the second largest variable in network latency. How long do devices in the path take to receive, process, and transmit information? As we saw before, just running the current through electrical paths is slower than fiber, but the router or switch has to do something with that information. It isn't a passive repeater. Here are some generic numbers for delay in the process. Please understand, these numbers are at best limited approximations. Each chip and OS will have different methods for doing these tasks, so the difference from one device to another can be massive. To process information, it can take anywhere from 10 to 1,000 microseconds. In the modern day, usually on the very lower end of that spectrum. Queue time is what happens when there's network contention. That is, when there's not enough bandwidth to service the packets that are flowing to an interface. It's impossible for us to judge because it's going to be a variable. But if it is in use, it will be a huge impact overall because effectively you're then taking the packet out of the fast path. And finally, once you have that data at the egress interface, there is about a 10 microsecond time to serialize and send that data out of the port. I want to take a moment here to talk about some specialty devices because eventually someone's going to bring these up. These specialty devices make an appearance in high demand and high value networks, such as high speed trading platforms on Wall Street. Because microseconds matter in these high speed trading platforms, they have funded the creation of specifically designed switches and infrastructure that can get this transit time down into the low single digit microseconds. But those are not common. They're highly focused and designed around a very narrow set of features, so they can't be used in generic networking. Another factor we have to keep in mind is that connection-based protocols such as TCP use a window size. This is a topic far too large to get into here, but I've added it to the ever-growing to-do list. For now, just know that TCP increases the amount of data it can have in flight across the network until it's transmitting faster than the remote side can return the acknowledgments of receipt. This is very important as TCP is designed to retransmit lost data. Thus, if the end system can't process and acknowledge the data quickly enough, TCP will limit the throughput regardless of the capacity available on the network. This is a very good thing, and we can get into that in the follow-up video. So let's boil this down. Latency is the bane of gaming, but there's only so much that can be done. Information is bound by the laws of physics, so it's not possible today to transmit faster than that. Further, no device that enables end-to-end connection does so without adding at least a little latency. However, in most cases, we design networks well. In the Amazon data center, they aren't going to send traffic between two servers over more switch ports than they have to. That's both a waste of capacity and the investment they make in the switches. I'd like to leave you all with one stat that I think will help you judge latency better than anything else. Optical signals in fiber add about 1 millisecond per 200 kilometers to the delay. We can see that network devices may or may not be adding meaningful latency to a connection. So there's no silver bullet here. Time for my opinion. I feel the best place to address latency is at the endpoints. The server and client, and, honestly, the home networks of the gamers. Seriously, ping your gateway. If you aren't seeing a response time of less than 1 millisecond, then for each millisecond above that, you are effectively imposing a 200-kilometer penalty on yourself. That means that for every millisecond you add, you are pushing yourself 200 kilometers further from everything on the internet in terms of latency. The gains that can come from efficiency there are far greater than the gains we can wring out of the transport networks at this point. Not that people like myself aren't doing everything we can to improve the network. We are. But even if we cut the router and switch latency in half, which would be epic to me, it wouldn't mean that much to any single gamer out there. At the end of the day, the latency we deal with in Star Citizen has very little to do with the network. Until they get server meshing going and have a chance to refine and optimize it, any network latency improvements would be insignificant to the experience of the player. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to watch these videos. If you found value, please hit the like button. If you'd like to see more content about both the technical side of Star Citizen and the worst boffin pilot embarrassing himself in-game, then hit the subscribe button. If you aren't a pandemic, I hope you're not a pandemic.